tonight it seems like it's only Unishunt, which is fine. This is a one-on-one code clinic, right? So if nobody else comes to see it, that doesn't mean that we're not going to help you. It does look like someone else is joining. But let's just jump right into your org. I actually ended up creating another user so I wouldn't have to bug you for the password.
Oh. Sorry about that. I didn't know that it's gonna ask the verification code. Otherwise,
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So let's just jump into developer console and we can start looking at your code. Somebody joined? Okay, I think somebody joined, but okay. So just reviewing your code, I spent a little bit of time looking at your code. Looks like you're getting an ID, contact ID, and then you're querying that ID in the account, and then you're calling some web service and passing both of them, and you're just making sure that there's no error.
Right.
And if there is an error, you're trying to send an email.
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing I'll say, and this is something that you said you're starting with development, right?
Right.
So how long have you been trying to write code? What's your background in code? Just tell me a little bit about that maybe.
Yes, no background in code. I self-taught admin. So I started as a junior admin, then eventually got promoted and work as a senior admin. But then I started understanding code, what's happening in the code. So anytime any user say, hey, this is throwing an error, so I just go into the code, read the code, try to debug, and used to give my developer a line and try to explain them, hey, this is the issue coming from. So I just got a new job, so I'm the only Salesforce guy in the company. And so I'm started developing something so I wrote very basic code, and now we have process builder and flow. So most of the stuff you can do through process builder and flow.
Yeah.
So I started learning, if you know David Liu, sfdc99.com.
Yes, absolutely. David Liu is a great resource, and he has a phenomenal blog. To anybody who watches this recording, SFDC99. It's Salesforce for the 99%, really. And David Liu is Salesforce MVP, who is works at Google, is also completely self-taught, and he just basically provides a phenomenal blog on how to start developing. So
right. So I enrolled in his that he has plural site course about the Apex development. So I did that course, and then I started developing, and then obviously there are so many blogs I follow. So I just go and try to get the best practice. So for this REST API call, I haven't found any one code which I try to understand and mimic. So this whole code is I took some lines from some code and I try to understand what's going on. And I have one PHP developer in house. He understands basic coding, so he helped me to build this. But if you see the code, it's not the perfectly written. That's what I can say. I have seen so many codes, so it's not perfectly written. So I say
So that's fine. That's fine, Nishan. So why don't we do this? Why don't we just go through this code and we can talk about what the different things do, and we'll see if there's any pointers that we can give. It looks like we have 2 viewers, observers that joined us. Welcome, if you're listening to us. Okay, so the first thing that I'll say, and I cannot stress this enough, and I think it's a really important thing to learn as a new developer, is that the formatting of your code, in terms of visual formatting, is something that is very important. And that means indentation and line breaks and all these other things. And as you start to look at code that is more complex than what you have here, formatting makes a world of a difference in how easy it is to read it and how easy it is to find what's going on. And so with your code, I can already tell you that formatting is not so good. Specifically, I can see here a public method, right, called account contact update. And what I would expect is everything after this open bracket to be indented further. So this way you can always see what is underneath or belongs to that. So normally I would say something like this, right? So you can say, hey, let's do this. And I would indent everything until the close bracket. And generally, every time that you have an open bracket, you indent one tab, or some people use spaces. But every time you open a bracket, whether it's for an if statement or for a for loop or for a method, you would indent an additional indentation, one more step forward. Now, the great thing about the developer console is that it has an auto indentation feature. So if I click Control A to select all of my code, and I click Shift Tab on my keyboard, you see how everything got jumped forward?
Right.
I'll undo it. So here you can see that you have two closed brackets that are right in the same line. And this method actually is a method inside your class. So your class is your lowest indentation, and I would expect every method to be indented one step, which is what you have here. So as I start and I select everything, you'll see that this jumps one, the public static void here will jump one indent forward and all the way to the close. So again, I'll click Shift Tab. And now you can see that it's very easy to see where one method starts and it ends usually in the same layer. And then I like to remove empty lines that just make it a little bit harder to read. And you can see that automatically everything that is in try, again, because there's an open bracket here, you see that everything is indented up until this bracket is closed. Right, so now when I look at it, it's really easy for me to see what you're doing here. Because now I can tell you, okay, oh, this is a try, and this is what you're trying. And here you have an if statement inside, and this is what, if this if is true, then this is what's going to happen. And this is what happens in your catch statement. Before that, it's just, well, actually, this was still indented correctly. But it's just a little hard to see, wait, is this try part of this method, or is it another method, and so on. So a lot of time you would think to yourself, okay, who cares? The code is code. The computer will execute it regardless of my line breaks and my formatting. And that is absolutely a true statement. But it makes it so much more readable, right? So when you look at a code that another developer wrote, or when another developer looks at your code, or even when you look at code that you wrote a while ago, this just makes it easier to read.
Definitely.
So I think I beat this one to a pulp. Another thing that I will say just as a general guideline before we even start looking at your code is commenting, right? So I can see here you have a comment and it says instantiating a new HTTP object, and that's fine. And you don't really need to align the equal signs. I guess that's maybe some practices, maybe some people do this, I'm sure where you copied it from. Maybe that's how they do it. I generally don't think it matters to that degree. But still, putting comments is also a really good way to make sure that if somebody else looks at your code, down the road when you're no longer with the company, or maybe in the future there's multiple developers working in the company and somebody else needs to look at it, they can really easily find what the purpose of this code is, right?
Right.
So I can say something like, here above this method accepts a contact ID, or rather the ID of a contact record, and queries its parent account and passes it as serialized JSON to our web service, or whatever it is, right? I'm obviously just kind of making up based on what I see the code is doing.
Right.
Right? So just general comments about code, right? Formatting is very important. Comments is very important. Those are things that will make your life so much easier in the future. And, you know, as a beginner developer, you kind of want to get used to doing those things correctly right from the start, because it's a lot harder to change your you know, behavior later down the line when you already have kind of your patterns established. So, okay, so this class called Future Apex Callout has two methods in it, right? Here's one method called Account Contact Update, and another method called Send Error Mail. And Send Error Mail, actually, as I highlighted, you can see where else this is. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Okay.
Okay. So you can see where else this code is referenced. So it's very easy to see, oh, this method is actually being called from, you know, the other method that we had, the first method. So, okay, so now we see that this method is expecting to receive an ID, and you call that ID con ID, which stands for contact ID. Whenever you have something like this in your class constructor, or whatever it's called, that means that every time that you call this method, you have to pass in an ID, right? If you try to call this method without passing an ID, what will happen?
It will throw an error, I think.
Yep.
Null.
It will say,
no idea.
Yeah, it actually say that it doesn't recognize the signature, because the signature of this method expects a contract ID or an ID. It doesn't actually have to be a contact ID. You can pass any ID in here and it will work. It will then fail when you run this, because it will say, hey, this con ID is not a contact ID. So we can actually try and see what happens in all of these scenarios. So this is what we call the signature. And if you try to call this with any other signature, it will tell you signature doesn't match or doesn't exist. So let's try that. I'm going to open anonymous code. I'm going to say future apex callout dot. Now this is, I love that the autocomplete here works very well, right? As we can see, it doesn't really autocomplete. But if I just delete it and I do it again, then it works. That's just an odd behavior of developer console. And I can see that this class has two methods. So which one do I want to call? Let's call this guy. And you see that it automatically populates this con ID. What happens if I try to call this without passing any ID? I'm going to execute. And it says method does not exist or incorrect signature. In other words, it says I could not find an account contact update method that doesn't expect anything in it. Whether it doesn't exist or the signature doesn't match, I couldn't find this method that doesn't expect anything. The same thing is if I try to do here, let's say, for example, integer I equals 6. And let's pass an integer in here. The same thing happens because it says, I'm looking for a void account contact update that accepts integer, but I can't, you know, this method doesn't exist or has an incorrect signature. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. If I'm wasting your time, if this is not what you had in mind, then please tell me.
No,
I'm just kind of going through everything I can think.
Yeah. This is very helpful.
Okay.
This is very, because it sets like the, you know, this is the perfectly fine, and this is very helpful.
Okay, good. So HTTP request and HTTP response are all objects in Salesforce that you can instantiate. And that means that this pattern of instantiating any object is similar to anything, right? Whether you want to create a string, so I can say string, my string, equals new string. right?
Right.
So exactly the same, but this time we're instead of a string, string is called what's the term? I'm having a little bit of a brain freeze today. It's called I can't remember, so let's just Google. Primitive, thank you. Thank you, Google. Primitive data types, right? All of the types of variables that accept what we call primitive data types, those are strings, integers, dates, datetime, Boolean. Those are all what we consider primitive data types.
Data types.
Okay, but Salesforce, you can also use contact, right? Contact is an S object, and I can create a new contact in memory by using exactly the same pattern, the same syntax, right? So I define which object, I give it a name, and then I say this is going to be a new of that object. Okay?
Right.
So the same exact thing for HTTP. HTTP is another class that is defined in Apex, and you're just creating a new one. And you're creating also what we call an HTTP request, which holds all of the information of what you want to send. And you're creating an HTTP response, which will hold all of the response information, what we get back from the web service.
Right.
So far, so good?
Yep.
Awesome. So now we're creating a string. We give it a name. It's called auth. And we give it some value. This is a string that I guess you have some authentication that the web service is expecting to get, right?
Right. So I have a question on this. So this is like, for the security reason, is it good to put like directly this string auth as a number, or we should try to create OAuth connection and then send username and password based on that?
So that's a really good question. Is it okay? Is it good? Is it good best practice to put your code, your authentication passwords or whatever it is in your code, hard code it? And the answer is absolutely no, it's not best practice. Right? So there are other ways to store your authentication in a way that is more secure, number one, and B, more manageable, right? So think about it this way. Right now, you're in a development environment, which means we can go here and we can change this code, right?
Right.
But with Salesforce, the moment that you have code in production, you cannot change it.
Yes.
The only way to, can you tell me what is the only way to change code in production?
You have to change in sandbox and then again push into production.
Exactly. So now if somebody changes the password, that now means you have to do a deployment, right? You have to go to your sandbox, you have to change your code, and you have to now deploy it to production, which means, time to upload the package, time to validate it, to run the tests, and only then you can use your new code. And that's not very efficient, right? Because codes and passwords are things that could change. So there's a bunch of different ways to store these things. Or I should say, historically, there would have been a bunch of different ways to store this. You could decide to store this in a custom setting, today in a custom metadata or whatever. But a few releases ago, Salesforce actually introduced something else called stored credentials, which have a purpose of exactly this purpose, really. So if we go back here and we go to the setup menu, I can go into a stored credentials. Not stored named credentials is the name. And I can create a new name credential. And I can give it some name, my credential. And here's the URL. So let's go and copy that URL one more time. And now you get to choose how is this authentication made. And authentication can be made anonymous, per user, or for a named principal. So here you have, not every user has their own password. So we have a named principal, meaning one user, one password that will work for everybody. And then how are you going to authenticate? You can use OAuth or you can use password authentication. Now, if your web service actually does support OAuth, you can absolutely do this. And we won't really go into the details of how to set OAuth right now. There's plenty of information out there on Google, right? But for our purpose, we will set up password authentication. And now you get to store your username and password. Now, you don't actually need a username, so I can put here whatever I want. And now let's copy this little password that you have. Okay? Now, stored credentials, named credentials can actually do a lot more for you than just storing information. But for now, let's leave it as is. Let's just see what do you do with that password. So is this authentication? I see that it's used in the body of the message. So it looks like you're passing the JSON data, and you're also passing authentication just as one more parameter in your body. Right? So there's many different ways that web services can use or ask for authentication. Sometimes the authentication has to be passed in a header. Sometimes you actually have to authenticate, like with Salesforce, you actually have to authenticate first, get a token, and only then you can use the token to do the rest of your work. So in your scenario, all you need to do is pass that password as part of your body. So let's just see something. Apex get named credentials. Let's see. So here we have a new request, set endpoint. This is interesting. This would be without. So this is without a name credential. This is exactly showing what you have done, which is hard coding the username and password. But I think what we need is actually this. Let's see. Okay. So what we need to do with our name credential is we actually need to say allow merge fields in HTTP body, because we need to use that password in your HTTP body. We're not actually asking Salesforce to authenticate for us. So let's see where that was. Merge fields. Now we can see here credential dot. So let's see. So we want to use credential.password. So let's just do this. Just replace this. And we just need to say, instead of credential, I think we just need to specify, let's see again, this code sample. I think instead of credential, we probably have to change it to, let's see. I think we just need to use the name of the name credential, whatever I called it, my name credentialed. So let's try that. give me a moment. Apologies.
No problem. Nope, no problem.
I wonder if we can just do this. Let's see. Here's your endpoint. So let's replace that. And we'll just say, what did I call it? My credential. And then we just want to add that path that you have here. And then let's try to use this guy. Here. So let's see if that works. I'm not sure if that's the right. That's interesting. Let's add one more system debug. Rec.body, and we'll say rec.getBody. We'll just output the body and see that the password has actually been passed. So now in order to execute, how can I execute this code? You know?
I think this will go directly into whatever the in-house system we have. So I think it won't, when you try to test, it won't let you connect because this is like not trusted environment.
That's okay.
So
that's fine. But how do I cause this code to run? How do I even run this code? If I want to test this, how would you test this now?
Can we just go into our Salesforce, get one contact ID, and go to execute anonymous screen and just
exactly.
Or
That's exactly what I was looking for. It's okay. So here's the contact ID. I can go to execute anonymous, and I can just include that contact ID in quotes, right?
Right.
And we see that it ran. And let's look at the debug statements. Interestingly, there's no debug here. And the reason is that I didn't look at actually the future. What I'm seeing is calling the future method. So let's look at a future handler, which is the actual execution of your code, your future class. This is interesting. I noticed this happened earlier when I looked in your environment as well. This was getting stuck when I was trying to open it. Okay, we'll do it the long way. Just going to say, actually, I think I can also just say open raw log. So it's not as helpful because I can't just tell it show me debug, but I can still search for the word debug here. So I'm looking for that word body actually. Here's the body. Here's the serialized data. And what I want to see is that in the end of this password has been appended. So it's going to be all the way to the end of this line. Doesn't look like it has. Looks like it actually still has credential password here. So we have to see how we use that. So using named credentials in HTTP body. Let's see. Choo, 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 choo. So it just looks like it's supposed to allow us to use this in body. I wonder if this only replaces the password. It probably only replaces the password and the actual. Yeah, that actually makes sense. It will only replace the password on the actual callout, not in the body itself. So the whole idea is that you as a developer now, you don't necessarily need to know the password, right? Whoever manages the credentials created it, and you're a developer, you can't even debug it. But when you call this, I think this should pass it as a credential into your web service. And that's something that's relatively easy to test, right?
Yes.
So I would recommend try to keep it this way, but if you have any issues, then just let me know and we can continue to look into this. Okay. In any case, the next thing that you're doing is you're querying a contact. You're basically getting the contact for which we passed the contact ID, and then you're getting account. And now you have a system debug here, but now you actually serialize them. Do you know what serialization actually means?
I think it means like I might be wrong, but you just want to make sure that like whatever the data that you are sending, it should be understandable by the system. I don't know, it's right or wrong.
Yeah, you're not very far. So JSON is an acceptable pattern, and it has a very, very specific pattern of how you pass data. And essentially, it's almost like an envelope with key value pairs, right? So, if you think about it, let's look again at the code, which I of course closed. Let me open this again. And let's look for the word JSON where you have that. So here's your serialized JSON. So I'm going to copy that for a moment. And let's see if this guy will help us. Okay, so it doesn't automatically do this, but what we can see sorry. Hold on, let me do this again. What happened? I think I got it into the wrong desktop. I just wish it was opening the thing properly, but here's the JSON. So I'll just copy this entire line again. Okay, so here's your JSON, right? And you see you have attributes, and this opens a new bracket. And in this bracket, you have your value pairs. So this is the key type, and which type is account. This is your key URL, and what URL is this? And that closes that attribute section. And now you have your billing address, which is all of these different things, right? And again, you have key value pairs. So a JSON is essentially just a way to describe a complex data. In this case, you have a full, let me just finish this. You have a full object with fields, and you want to show them in essentially one string of text. So that's what serialization does. It creates this grouping and the key value pairs for you. So when you say serialize, it automatically creates this one single string that represents your entire account in this case. Okay? So the first thing you're doing is you're serializing the account, then you're serializing the contact. And that means that all of the fields that you queried here, in this case ID, first name, last name, email, phone, and account ID, will be serialized into the single string. And you can say it's string because you're even assigning it to a string, right? And so you're doing this, and then you're creating, here's the JSON. This is what I actually want to pass to my web service. And you're basically just, all you're doing is you're concatenating them. You're actually you're extending that JSON by saying, I'm creating a higher level group that says contact, and then I have the JSON contact, and then account and the account JSON. Sorry, the contact JSON and the account JSON. So you're creating a slightly more complex JSON, serialized JSON, by doing this. Is that clear? If you want to go into more details? Okay.
Nope.
And then the next thing you're doing is you're setting up your endpoint, your method. In this case, it's post. So REST APIs, REST Web Service support different types of methods. So you can do post, which is generally for inserting. They do get, which is usually basically query, right? Give me an existing record. There's update, and there's delete.
So can you use in one future call, can you use get and post together?
I believe the answer is yes.
Okay.
I believe the answer is yes. And viewer 13, whoever that is, answered yes.
Okay.
Okay. Just give me 1 second.
Yep. No.
Sorry. Who is viewer 13, by the way?
That's me. Hi, my name is Chris. I came onto this call late, and I'm supposed to be spectating, but hi.
No, thank you, Chris. I appreciate the input.
Yeah, just be careful of the limits in terms of the number of HTTP callouts in an execution context. If you're making multiple callouts, there's 120-second max callout time. So just be mindful of that.
Okay. Thanks,
yep, that's
Chris.
A good point. Thank you very much. So yeah, you can mix and match them. There's a total number of callouts you can make in one execution context, and there's also the time limit, as Chris mentioned, right? So if you look at Salesforce governor limits, right away this showed up, but let's just come in here. And we want to look actually for callouts. And here's your total number of callouts in a transaction is 100. And the maximum cumulative time is 120 seconds. So if you have a web service that takes 100 seconds to execute for whatever reason, and you're trying to call it twice, or you're trying to call that and then a few others, you may exceed the time.
Okay.
Okay? So there's other ways to get around some of these limitations, specifically using something called Queueable Jobs, which is kind of an evolution of future classes. Will allow you to chain different future methods, essentially chain different asynchronous jobs together. So the header essentially contains information about how is your data structured, how is it formatted, what encoding in this case. And then your body is really what information you're trying to pass. And so in this case, you're passing your JSON data, which is this, and you're adding to this the authentication. And I assume that this is what your web service is expecting to. This is the format that your web service is expecting to get the data in. And so the next thing we're trying to do, now we built this request, right? We told the request where is it going, we called it the method, we set up the header and the body, and we're ready to now say, okay, Salesforce, now that you know exactly where this request is going and what it should say and how, go ahead and do it. And so to cause it to do this, you actually assign, you use this response object that you class, that you defined earlier, that you instantiated earlier, and you say, let's do the HTTP send. So the HTTP class that you also defined has a method called send, and I'm telling you, send this specific request that we built up here. And this send method returns an HTTP response. And because it returns a response, we want to assign it to an HTTP response variable, which we luckily defined here. We instantiated one here, and it's sitting there waiting to get something assigned to it. And so all you're doing with this line, you're saying, hey, use this HTTP class and call the send method. What should you send? It's this request that we defined here. And the results of all of this, assign them to the response variable. Okay? And then the response class has its own set of methods and attributes. So let's look at this. Apex HTTP response. So here's the response class, and here's some examples of using it, but here are all the methods that it has. So now that you got the response, you may want to get the body of the response, or the body is a blob. Blob is a binary large object. You can get the body of the document. You can get the header of the response. You can get the status of the response or the status code. So all of these different things mean different things. But what you can see here is that you're checking, and I know that you copied this code. So if you don't know what it's already doing, then we're looking at the status first. And I'm saying if the status is bad request, which essentially means, hey, we contacted your web service, and the web service said, I don't understand the request you sent to me. It's a bad request. So we're saying if the status is bad request or the status code is different than code 200, then do something. Now, code 200 is actually HTTP REST codes. So REST has predefined codes that can define different things that happened. And specifically 200 is okay.
Okay.
So generally the expectation is that when you pass something to a web service, if you passed it correctly, it will give you what we call a 200. It will give you an, okay, I got it. It can also give you a 400 or a bad request. So it's interesting that here it says, look for the status, string bad request or the code that is different than 200. But you could also replace this line with exactly, if we wanted, we could replace this line with if response.get status code is equal to 400, or the same response.get status code, and I should have done that here as well, is equal to 400. But the problem is now here we're saying if it's not equal. So now I'm saying if it is equal, right? So what I can do is I can say, there's two ways for me to do it. I can say if it's equals bad request or it's not 200, right? So in other words, they're saying if it is bad or it's not good. So I can also say if it's not equal to 400 and not equal to 400. This should be 200. So I'm saying if it's not a bad request and it's not okay, then do this.
Okay.
So this is essentially almost the same thing. There's just a couple of different ways to write this. Statuses have a message and they have a code. So in this case, you're just using one is a message and one is the code. But what you're saying is if it is bad request or if it's not okay, which really could be any one of these bad requests, forbidden, really anything that says it wasn't okay, then we want to send an email that tells us what was the code and what was the status. Make sense?
Yep.
So we're trying this, and if an exception is thrown, then we get into this catch block. And you're essentially doing the same. You're saying, if there's any other error other than, just the web service didn't work, if there's any other message, then here you're just saying if we contacted the web service and we got the web service responded with, hey, this is not okay, or this was a bad request, let's send an email. This catch is even if we couldn't even reach out to the web service, then it would go into this catch block. So an example of how this could happen is if for example, we didn't have, whenever you go outside of Salesforce, when you try to use a web service, you have to actually add it as an authorized endpoint. So when I looked into your organization today, actually that wasn't set there.
Right.
But I added it, right? So here's site complete, and I added this endpoint. If this endpoint wasn't there, this wouldn't even succeed. It would get an exception, and it would go into the sketch block.
Yeah, and I already got that error message that
yep.
the endpoint is not valid, or it's not
yep.
set.
So that's exactly what it does. So this is saying, hey, if the web service told us, hey, you're trying to send me something, or you're trying to do something that I'm not designed to do, or I don't know how to accept, then this is one type of error. And this is any other error in trying to contact the web service. And then in both of the scenarios, you're calling the same method that's called send error mail, and you're just passing a string, what message you want to send the error, and then this is sending the error. So there's really not much more. I mean, I don't want to go through this. Before we stop or continue, is Hima on the line? Hima, are you here? Oh, I see her connected. Hima, if you can hear me, I can't hear you. So, Nishant, we're pretty much at the end of our time right now. So,
yep.
We don't really, I think this is pretty straightforward. You're instantiating something called a single email message.
I totally understand that, like how it works.
Okay. So do you have any other questions at this point?
I think, no, that's pretty helpful. That's amazing.
I'm glad. Let's see. Hima, no, Hima, I cannot hear you. So if you can try to dial in again, please do that. If you're trying to use a computer, maybe instead try to dial in. But you'll probably have the same issue you had last week. So yeah, is there anything here that is not clear to you, or anything that you have as follow-up questions?
So just one thing, if you scroll up.
Mm-hmm.
So like the way that I wrote, so when I'm initiate the new HTTP object, so normally that HTTP object, like anyway I do, but like the best way to do is after the query, or it doesn't matter? It's just
it really doesn't matter.
Okay.
It really doesn't matter. The only thing I would recommend here to change, I mean, this code is pretty simple. There's nothing complex happening here. There's not much that I can tell you, or you can make it much more efficient. Okay? The only thing I would say is, just like you didn't want to hard code the password, it's probably not a good idea to hard code your email.
Okay.
Because if somebody else, if you leave, how are they going to change it? Somebody is going to have to go and deploy code just to change your email. So to do this, I would recommend. What?
This is just a testing purpose. I have the different email address which goes out to like the whole team.
Okay, yeah, but still, I would not recommend using an email address, even if it's for team. I wouldn't recommend just hard coding an email address, because if things change, right? At some point they may say, you know what, this email should go to a different team going forward, or anything could change. So instead of doing this, I would say that you may want to do something like using custom metadata or custom setting to store the email address, and then you can query for that custom metadata or custom setting right in here to get the value. But that means that then an admin can just use the setup menu to go to custom settings and change it.
And then change it. Okay, got you.
Right from here, without having to make any code change. So anything related to hard coding in code is a bad idea. Email addresses, passwords, usernames, record IDs, anything that is really something that you're just saying, hey, this is what I need for now, is not a good idea, because it could be very different in the future. And you want to simplify it for an administrator, so you don't necessarily need a developer to make these kind of changes.
Yep.
Okay?
Perfect.
Beyond that, the code looks pretty straightforward, and I think it should work. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with it.
I think it's working. It's just like I want to make sure like it is follow the best practice, and some of the pointers you mentioned, I already written it down, and I will make that change. And yeah, it's working. I already wrote the test class. Like you have to write the mock test class, because you cannot generate the code coverage with the rest and future. So I already wrote that. I wrote like I already got like 93% code coverage. So yeah. So thank you very much, Ohad, one more time, and I really appreciate it. And like see you in the future. I think if I have any questions.
Absolutely. You're invited to come back for any more consults if you need, or you're invited to join as an observer to see what other people may ask. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night,
see you hopefully in the next ones.
All right.
Bye, Chris. Yep. Bye, Nishant. Bye, Nima. Bye, Nicholas, and whoever else is here. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good night.
You too.